Calix Morvan sprang from his cot, cloak snagging on the splinter-thin bunk as dawn tore across the field. The canvas tent breathed with heat and damp wool, the air thick with soap and iron and something sweeter that did not belong, smoke washing in from the distant fires. The ghost of a horse sweating through leather tack. Calix's throat rasped with the taste of oats and fear as he rubbed grit from his eyes, the dawn light crawling like a pale snake along the poles. The smell of liniment and stale beer clung to the air, despite the doctor's best efforts to keep it clean. A fly buzzed impatient above a bowl of half-scoured instruments laid out in a patient circle on a pine bench. "Calix," came a voice, rough with sleep and whiskey scent. A nurse's voice, Neil's, though not the one he trusted to soothe him at night. "The surgeon's asking for you." The operation's to begin, he stood, body heavy with a night's rest that hadn't rested him at all, and crossed the tent's cold floor, the denim of his trousers rough against his knees, the air cooler near the open flap. The resin of pine boards, smoke and antiseptic, pressed in his lungs as if the very tent desired to swallow the sound of his breath. The hospital's bustle found him with a suddenness that felt almost tactile. Boots clacked on wooden planks. The hiss of a bottle being uncorked, ether perhaps or alcohol, swallowed the air and left behind a bitter tang on Calix's tongue. The surgeon's table stood at the far end, a line of steel tools catching glints of pale daylight, the surrounding oak chairs and benches worn smooth by years of fear and necessity. A low murmur rose and ebbed, a tide of voices trading the day's news the way soldiers trade rumors of when the next march will break. In the center of it all, a tall man with a napkin and a grin that did not reach his eyes, Dr. Elias Harrow, stood with a candle's warm glow catching the glint of a blade's edge. Harrow's hands moved as if they remembered other patients' bodies, as though the memory of their lines might steady the tremor in his wrists. He wore a surgeon's coat, but you could smell the faint bite of whiskey on his breath, a scent that clung to the ceremony of medicine, as if obedience and intoxication could be conjoined truths. Calix did not want to look at the man. He wanted to look away from the risk and the ruin, and the men who bore those who would never walk again, whose limbs would never again anchor their souls to anyone's story but pain. But the moment pulled him toward the table, toward the patient's chair, toward a fate that his body did not know how to outrun. "Private Morvan," Dr. Harrow said, the words level and careful as a surgeon's cut, though the voice carried a rasp of whiskey that should have been a warning. "You are fast before us because you've learned to hold your breath. We've a trauma that needs addressing, a wound in the groin area." He glanced at a scribbled note on a clipboard, the kind of note that promised evidence of calculations and the mercy of a plan, "and we must proceed to preserve life as best we know how." Calix's breath sounded loud in his ears, a drumbeat inside his skull. The tent's canvas size, the roughness of the table's oilcloth under his forearms, the patient footfalls of those not fighting the war, but the war's aftermath. These textures pressed into him like a map of every night he'd spent on the march. Every morning he'd woken to a world that would not forgive him for his mistakes, his fear, his aching body. He looked toward the nurse, a woman who wasn't smiling and who had the steadiness of a lighthouse in a storm. She offered him a glassy nod, a small gesture to let him know she would not abandon him, even when the ground beneath him might fail. The plan came as a matter of course, an amputation, a recommended removal of the organ believed damaged, an attempt to salvage what could be salvaged from a battlefield body. Calix did not know which wound the man who loves him most would call for mercy. He was merely a living letter to be closed in order to spare the rest of him from bleeding out in the mud. The room's light flickered as if the dawn itself trembled at what it would witness. The lamp's flame hissed. The smell of ether and linen and copper rose to Calix's nose, and the world narrowed to a single point, the sharp, clean glint of steel, the quiet thud of boot on floorboards, the sound of a breath drawn too deeply through a throat that would never be the same after today. "Calix," whispered the nurse again, not unkindly, as if she knew the words would flood through him like seawater. "We'll do what's best to keep you whole, in so much as we can." Scroll of thoughts like a soldier's logbook opened in Calix's mind, names, faces, the rough texture of bar soap in the camp, the creak of the tent's poles, the way the world's noise thrummed even in the quietest hours, when the heartbeat of the war slowed and people listened for what their bodies could not tell them. He thought of the first time his mother's linen dress brushed his skin, Of the night, he learned to swallow fear rather than spit it out. Of the days when his breath came in dry, gusts because his world had become a field of banners and blasts. The actual operation began with a whistle of cold air and a clang of metal, as if the camp itself shouted at the surgeon to be careful, to remember the lines of anatomy that lay beneath the skin. The room grew colder as the ether cloud thickened, and Calix felt his body becoming something foreign, as if a door had opened somewhere and a part of him moved there, a thing that did not belong to the soldier who had marched through the dunes of summer and across the swollen rivers of rain. Dr. Harrow's hands trembled, not from fear but from a drink's aftertaste that clung to him like damp cloth. He spoke in clipped phrases and timetable anxieties, a cadence that belonged to a measured life rather than the chaos of field surgery. "Clamp here, gentle. Steady now." The surgeon's voice rose above the murmur of the room, and Calix's own breath came in shallow little puffs, as if a child's lungs could still learn to live in this world. The nurse's eyes watched, always watching, not letting a corner of the room vanish into a lie. The moment came suddenly, a sterile incision's whisper, a sound even the paper-thin air could hear, the mere whisper of steel on flesh that could never be heard again with the same innocence. The room swayed with a sudden gust of something sweet and sharp, perhaps a misdirected breath from a patient elsewhere, perhaps fear, perhaps the memory of every mistake that has ever followed a soldier into the brittle morning after war. Calix was not allowed to count what happened next. The world narrowed to a single sensation, a roughness, a shock, a strange, numbing quiet, before he realized the doctor had begun the procedure in earnest. And then he could not look away from the red and the pale, the way the flesh looked in that light, as if the body itself were a map of some country he would never reach. When it ended, the silence settled over the room like a blanket. The nurse moved to cover Calix with a clean linen sheet. The smell of freshly cleaned skin and antiseptic hung in the air like a winter night's breath. Calix's gaze drifted toward the surgeon's gloved hands and the instruments laid out on the tray, their cold gleam a cruel reminder of what had just happened. "What have you done?" he heard himself ask, though his mouth was dry as desert sand and his tongue felt useless, heavy with defeat. The word came out as a whisper, a thing you might lean toward in prayer and find only a prayer's echo answered. "Hush now." "Boy," Harrow said softly. The whiskey on his breath a sharp sting in Calix's memory, a scent that would not leave his clothes for days. "We did what was necessary. You'll be relieved. Relieved that the quicker we finish, the quicker we close this wound and move forward." The doctor's words were cold calculus. They did not soothe the sting of the knowledge or the prick of the knowledge that something was terribly wrong. They did not soothe Calix's mind, which was already racing down an unfamiliar road toward despair. The aftermath unfolded with a terrifying calm. The pain, when it came, was a distant thunder, a series of punctuated thunderclaps, in which each beat sounded like a decision and a consequence. Calix lay in the bed after the operation, a white sheet cradling him, the edges warm with the body's own fever, the room smelling faintly of iodoform and the sour tang of old linen. The nurse adjusted his blanket, her gloved fingers brushing against his bare skin at the edge of the sheet, a touch both clinical and intimate, as if to remind him that someone still cared even as his body betrayed him. The following hours stretched like a desert afternoon. His mind wandered through a maze of thoughts, whether the battle would judge him for surviving, whether the men who would never walk again would be told the truth about a surgeon's fault, whether his own future would be a map of shame and silence. He heard the muffled voices outside the tent. Orders barked, the creak of a wagon, the distant howl of a horse, as if the animal himself could sense the wrongness of what had just occurred. In the days that followed, Calix's neighbors, the men who shared his bedroll and his fear, searched for the voice the war had robbed from them. They spoke in clipped phrases, with a soldier's honesty that would cut the skin of any good man. They spoke of pain as if it were a currency, and they traded it for bread and sleep, and the smallest hope that a doctor might tell the truth, or at least spare them from the burden of guilt. Calix, meanwhile, found himself listening for a sound that could never be a sound again, the sound of his own voice, speaking his own truth. The amputation's error did not simply rob him of a physical feature. It dislodged something more fragile inside him, a sense of manhood, a future, a name that could be spoken with pride. a body that would feel the touch of another human being without the ache of ridicule and fear. The hospital's days took on a ritual that grew heavier with each sunrise. The surgeons would prepare for more work. The nurses would hush the room with a practiced quiet. The soldiers would exchange glances that spoke volumes about the war's long memory. Calix watched this choreography with a careful distance, a spectator who could not escape the acrid scent of adrenaline and the metallic taste of fear on his lips. Dr. Harrow did not pretend to forget. He did not pretend the day's work was clean of error or apology. He spoke in measured terms to the hospital's officials, his voice carrying the whiff of whiskey. The notes of responsibility and arrogance interwoven like threads in a wasted tapestry. "It was not my intention to harm him," Harrow said at one tense meeting, the room smelling of cordite and coffee as official men weighed the facts. "I was presented with a wound and a protocol. We did what we could, and now we must proceed with care." But the "we" that he invoked did not include Calix. The soldier lay in his bed, listening to the voices and feeling the weight of the room pressed down on his chest as if to say, "You belong here because you survived, but you may never be whole again." The days blurred into a sequence of conversations, one with the nurse who would bring him tea and a slow smile, another with a comrade who would slip a letter or a joke into the blanket's edge in an attempt to lift the gloom, and a third with his own inner voice, which grew louder and more insistent with every minute that passed, echoing the idea that something fundamental had been taken from him, and that the loss might be the first true wound of all. Calix's thoughts often drifted to the what-ifs, the medic's mishandling, the mistaken wound, the quickness with which a life was altered due to one man's misstep and another man's weakness. The memory of the operation gnawed at him, a blackened thread that tugged at his spine even when he slept, sending him into dreams where he stood on a battlefield at dawn and felt only cold air and a surgeon's cold hands. The hospital's corridors carried other voices, stories of other men who had suffered other devastations, some soldiers who could still speak, their mouths forming words that never quite made it past the throat sphere, others who carried a different kind of silence, a silence that would echo in a man's chest for all his days. Calix listened to these voices and did not try to answer them. The silence had learned his name and kept it. Then came the third day after the operation, the day when the whispers turned into something sharper, something that could strike like a blade and leave a mark that would never heal. That morning, the hospital's chief surgeon, an older man with the weathered hands of many years of field work and the eyes that had seen too much, stood by Calix's bed's edge, the curtain of a morning sun slanting across the room. The scent of strong coffee rose from the cup in his hand, the liquid black and steaming, a small island of comfort in the room's colder heat. "Calix," the man began, his voice gentler than the whiskey-sour softness of Harrow's, but still carrying a weight that made Calix sit up straighter, as if a command had entered his bloodstream. "We need to talk about the operation, about what's been found." Calix looked at the man with pale eyes that had learned to hold still in the moment before a shot rings out. He pressed his lips together, the taste of copper on his tongue again, the memory of blood's metallic tang returning with each breath like a bad omen. "What is there to talk about?" he asked, his voice a low rasp, the sound of a man who has learned too much in too little time. The chief surgeon's gaze rested on Calix, as if weighing him in a scale that mattered more than the body's own weight. "We have reason to believe the wound you sustained, what was believed to be a pelvic trauma, was misinterpreted. It's possible the removal was of the wrong organ entirely." Calix felt the room tilt for a heartbeat, a small, frightening maneuver that reminded him of standing on a cliff edge and suddenly realizing the ground has moved. His breath held, his chest tightened, and for a moment he forgot to blink, as if the act of blinking would erase the surgeon's words or erase the world's memory of what had been done. "Wrong organ," he repeated, tasting the words as if they were bitter medicine, the sort that doesn't cure you but makes you swallow anyway. "What organ was it, doctor? Tell me plainly." The surgeon's mouth pressed into a line that was almost a smile, but not quite. His eyes were tired, and you could see the war's long weathering in their corners. "It is not my place to sensationalize a tragedy," he said, the words chosen with caution, as if a single misstep could throw the soldiers' lives into further chaos. "But if the records are accurate, the injury you were treated for, your initial wound, appears to have included a serious risk in the groin." The procedure, regrettably, did not target that area only, though the wrong organ was removed to prevent infection and to try to salvage life. Calix's mouth opened, then closed again. The room filled with the sound of his own breath, short and painful, like a cough he could not shake. He thought of his body's shape, the way his clothes clung to his legs and hips and stomach, the way each curve of his skin told a story of all the times he had faced danger and lived. How would this shape tell his story now? What would the world see when he walked into it, if he walked at all? The physician who performed the operation, Calix asked, his voice a thread between fear and fury. The man who drank, where is he now? Harrow's ghost of a smile appeared for a moment in the chief surgeon's eyes, and then vanished. Harrow. I believe Sir Dr. Harrow remains with this unit under watch. He spoke softly, but the words hit Calix, as if a cold blade had passed across his mind and then pressed into his chest. A reminder that the man whose breath had touched Calix's skin during the operation was still walking the same grounds, still touching the same tools, still within reach of someone's life. Calix could not soften his voice to a controlled calm. The river of anger in his chest rose, storming through his ribs, a flood that swallowed every careful instinct. A mistake like this cannot be hidden, he said, the words rising with a sudden heat that surprised him, the heat of a man who had never been given a voice by the world, but who would not stop speaking now. If you knew it was wrong, if the organ was wrong, you must tell the truth. The surgeon's mouth tightened again. There are procedures to protect patients and to address errors when they occur, he answered, his tone measured, almost too calm for a man who had himself tasted the edge of a blade, though not the blade of moral consequence. For we will handle this through proper channels. Calix's eyes burned. He remembered the smell of alcohol on Harrow's breath, the way the doctor's hands trembled not from fear, but from the aftertaste of whiskey, and through the certainty that a man like Harrow could slip from his duty as easily as he could slip on a boot in a muddy trench. Was there truth in the chief surgeon's claim, or had another layer of concealment just been added to the patient's wound? One day, Calix said, his voice barely above a whisper, you will tell the truth. You will tell the world what was done. If not for me, then for the future men who will lie beside a bed in your care. He felt the words leave his mouth like a threat, wrapped in a prayer. The room's air seemed to tighten around him, as if a net had been thrown across the bed and he could not escape it. The chief surgeon's response was a quiet, clinical assurance. We will investigate. We will address any errors, but for the moment, we must ensure your physical healing. First and foremost. Healing, Calix knew, would come with time, but the deeper wound lived on in the truth he carried, the sense that the body had failed him, not simply due to injury, but due to a misreading, a mistake that could never be repaired with a clean cut or a bandage. In the days that followed, the hospital's routine did not slow. It turned the wheel with a steady rhythm, marching forward while Calix's own body and mind lagged behind. The bed's sheets smelled faintly of soap and the sour tang of old blood. The room carried a chorus of little noises, a nurse's cough, a window latch creaking in a breeze, a horse's distant call from the camp beyond the trees. The air carried a scent of antiseptic, strong enough to sting the back of the throat, and the taste of copper lingered in Calix's mouth whenever he spoke. And yet within that routine, a different sound began to surface, a sound that was half rumor and half truth, something like a wind turning a page of a ledger. People began to talk about the surgeon's sobriety, about the precision of his hands, about the possibility that the operations plan had not aligned with the actual injury, and about the consequences for the patient's future life. The talk came in the quiet hours, when the tents held their breath, when the lantern's flame would tremble and the night nurse would move in with a whispered update. Calix listened. He listened to the other soldiers talk, to the nurse's careful words, to the way the air carried across the room the faint odor of soap and sweat and fear. He listened to his own heart thudding inside him, a rhythm that grew louder whenever his mind wandered to the idea that the surgeon had drunk on the day and later, had insisted on the plan's necessity. A plan now proven to have fallen short, a plan that had denied him not only his stigma, but his humanity. One afternoon, the day's light pale and bronze as a coin, Calix found himself alone in the ward, save for a solitary figure who sat by the window, their silhouette a shadow against the glass. It was a young nurse, Mara, a girl with a stubborn jaw and hands that moved with a precision that reminded Calix of a watchmaker. "Calix," she began softly, not as a question, but as a confession she might have whispered to a friend under a different sky. The smell of their tea rose with steam, faintly sweet and full of tobacco smoke from the hallway. The men talk. They say the doctor drank, and that maybe he made a mistake that cost you more than you should bear. Her words settled in his chest like a stone, heavy, not exactly a weight he could shift with ordinary effort. He looked at the window's edge and watched a bee circle a crack in the wood, the insects careful. Mindless persistence, a small relief from the room's gravity. "I've thought of it," Calix admitted, his voice rough with disuse, as if he had forgotten the sound of his own words. "If he drank, then he didn't see what he cut." Mara's eyes dropped to the floor, then rose again. "People like to pretend they know what they would do in a moment of crisis," she said. "But crisis is loud, Calix. It's loud and it's blind and it doesn't care about what you want for yourself." Her empathy did not absolve the pain, but it offered a small shred of company, a compass of honesty in a field hospital's complicated morality. They spoke in short sentences, brisk as drills, their exchanges sparse yet heavy with significance. Calix asked questions that had no answers, and Mara offered him quiet, unspoken support. The air between them was not friendly. It was a shared acknowledgement that a line had been crossed, and there would be a cost. The days moved with a careful gravity, like march songs slowed to a dirge. Calix learned to live with the absence that his body wore at the most intimate level, a reminder that the world did not always tell the truth about what it did to a person in war. He would lay his palm on the sheet, as if the skin's texture could tell him where to go, what to do, how to breathe again. Yet every morning when he woke, the memory of the operation came to him, as if a name he once knew had suddenly become a stranger in the room. Time in war zones often forces a harsh pruning of what you think can be trusted, and Calix found that his sense of self, his masculine identity, his future as a man, his claim on his own body, was being cut away with every new report, every whispered rumor, every check mark in a ledger that might or might not tell the truth. The hospital staff continued their investigations and their careful allocations of blame where blame seemed due. The doctors argued about the protocol and whether it allowed for the possibility of error. The nurses argued about the patient's comfort and whether they could shield him from the truth's blunt edge. The soldiers argued about who would tell the family if a letter ever reached them that their son had survived a war's mortar, but not a single. Private sense of self. Calix listened to the debate in the medical tent with a patient patience that belonged to a man who had learned to listen to the wind when the world stopped listening to him. He found a quiet mercy in those moments, a way to reframe the day's fear into something that could be carried like a shield rather than a stone. He also had moments of simple longing, moments when he would lie back, the sheet cool on his skin, and imagine a time when the war would end and there would be a life to live, a woman to share it with, a chance to be seen as a complete man again. He did not imagine how it would happen. The mind's machinery did not operate with a plan for such a repair. It only asked for time, and perhaps for someone to look him in the eye and say that the scar did not define him, that the person behind the scar remained a person who could love and be loved. 3 days after the operation, the hospital's mood shifted, as if a wind had shifted from north to south and carried something unsaid into the room. Calix lay on his back, a dull ache banding his hips and belly, the bedclothes cool on his skin. The sun cast an orange line across the canvas. The room smelled faintly of coffee and wet wool. A nurse passed by, then paused, glancing at Calix with a look that was almost kindness, as if she wanted to offer solace, but did not know how to phrase it without violating some code of professional restraint. "Calix," the nurse said softly, not meeting his eyes but addressing him as if the matter she would speak of required discretion as well as empathy. "There's something you ought to hear." Her voice pulled him from the thread he had been weaving with his thoughts, a thread that could unravel the moment someone whispered the word truth. Calix turned his head toward her, feeling the rough cotton of the pillow against his cheek, the breath he exhaled turning to a warm puff in the room's still air. "What is it?" His voice sounded tired, older than his years, older than any man should be when his body still sought to wake with strength. Her lips pressed into a line, then parted as if to offer him a careful apology that would never be enough. "There's an inquiry," she said, a whispered confession that she would have preferred to keep to herself, lest it stir the room's fragile peace into a chaos that cannot be unspoken. "The records indicate an error, An error in the organ removed. It's being reviewed. They want to understand how this could happen and who must bear responsibility. Calix closed his eyes for a long breath, the sting of the room's dryness on his lips. He did not cry, not in that moment, but his chest grew heavy with a weight he had learned to carry in silence. The news did not come to lift him. It came to remind him that even the world's most intimate truths could be gamed by the system, that a person's body could be used as a ledger line in someone else's arithmetic. "Do they think I'll live with this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question was not just about survival, but about the meaning of survival after such a mistake. The nurse's breath hit the air, a small hopeful thing, as if she believed in the possibility of a future that would not be defined by the amputation. "They'll find a way to help you live with what's happened," she said, the message not quite a comfort but a sentence of intention, a line drawn in the sand. Calix did not answer for a long moment. He watched the room's slow, patient clockwork, as if the ticking could outpace his own thoughts. Then, with a trembling exhale that did not reach a laugh, he spoke. "If they think a future can grow from a wound of this kind, they have never walked with a soldier through 3 days that feel like 3 deaths stitched together." The nurse offered a soft smile that did not pretend to erase the truth. "We will try," she said, and her words landed on him with the dull ache of a sparking wire. "We will try to help you live with this." That afternoon, Calix was visited by a few men who had seen more of dying than of living. That constant. Quiet chorus of those who know the war will not end. Not in one season, not in a lifetime. Some of the men spoke of mercy, others spoke of justice, and a few spoke of revenge in the old, bitter tongue a soldier learns when words fail. Calix listened to their talk with an open, listening heart, his body responding to each neighbor's syllables with a tremble that he could not control. The men's hands lay on the bed's edge, their fingers curling around the sheet as if to remind themselves that some things remained, even when the earth seemed to tilt beneath their feet. They spoke in short, clipped phrases that begged for courage, and Calix allowed their voices to fill the room, to push against the heavy silence that had settled in his chest. The most profound moment of that day came not in accusation, but in an act of memory. A quiet, private scene in which Calix's mind wandered to a small, ordinary thing that the war had taught him to hold dear for fear of losing it. A conjuring of the sound of a woman's voice, the memory of a song they had sung in camp, a time when his heart believed the world might eventually allow him to become a man again, in the full sense. A man who could smile at a partner's touch and know that the future would not be carved by a doctor's mistake, but by his own choices. It was not a dream of romance, not exactly. It was a dream of belonging, of a future where his body's truth could be spoken without shame, and where love could cross the boundary of pain and reach his core. He did not know if such a future could exist. The war's memory had a way of erasing such fragile hopes with one stroke of a soldier's hand, yet the dream persisted. Stubborn as a weed in a field's corner, tender, uninvited, and dangerous for the hope it carried. The days and now the nights moved along with that same quiet, inexorable rhythm. And then one night, in a moment when the tent outside the hospital lay quiet except for the soft shuffle of feet and the distant, uneasy breath of the river beyond, Calix found himself alone with a choice he had not anticipated making. He stood at the edge of the bed and felt the cold air press against his skin through the thin sheet, felt his heartbeat drum a rhythm that would not be silenced. The world's sounds, someone coughing in a neighboring bed, the rattling of a distant cart, the whisper of the river, came to him as if through a screen, a layering of life and death and decision that he would never forget. Calix's mind drifted to the idea of escape, not in a grand sense but in a small practical way, a choice to end the pain, to step beyond the pain's reach and find a place where the body's misfortune could not reach him again. He thought of a lifeline other men had found in the past, the quiet, private way of ending a life when the world's weight grew too heavy. He did not want to die. He wanted the pain to end, and he did not know what else to do to end it. But in that moment of stillness, the hush of the room's night, the soft breath of the river outside, Calix looked toward the door and saw a shadow cross the threshold, a reminder that this world was not a private room for a solitary decision, but a world that would continue to force him to live, to speak, to be seen by others who would judge or pity or forget. The shadow belonged to Mara, the nurse, who kept time with his fear, and who now offered a different kind of mercy, Calix, she whispered, stepping inside with measured caution. Not wanting to startle him or intrude on a private crisis, but knowing there was a conversation that needed to happen in order for both of them to survive the night. Her voice did not carry whiskey's weight or the hospital's stiffness. It carried something like a tether, a way to remind him that life could still be held, even if the hold was imperfect and the future uncertain. "People are talking," she began, and her words felt heavy with the unspoken. "Some fear what comes after this news. Some fear the truth will ruin men who've already suffered enough." Calix turned his head toward her, his eyes reflecting a pale glow from the lamp on the nightstand. The room's smell of soap, linen, and the faint chemical bite of alcohol was a chorus that did not relent, but her voice steadied his breath in a way that felt almost holy. "What is someone supposed to do with a life that's been rewritten in the middle of its own story?" Calix asked, his voice low, almost a murmur. "What is a man supposed to do when the body he's lived in betrays him?" Mara took a hesitant step closer, the bed's rails creaking softly under her palm as she moved. "We fight for a future," she said, choosing her words with care. "We do not deny the past, and we do not pretend that the past did not hurt us, but we fight for the chance to be more than what we were born as, or made to become by other men's mistakes. If you can let us help, we will do it, however we can." Her offer did not erase the night's heavy fear, but it gave him a choice that did not involve despair's full embrace. He looked at her, at the glint of truth in her eyes, and for a moment he believed that his life could still be argued into a future where he would not be the sum of others' failures or the product of a misread instrument. "Thank you," he murmured. The words rough at the throat, as if he had forgotten how to speak, as if his voice had learned only to be quiet in the face of war's unkind arithmetic. "I'm listening." They spoke in the old half-quiet way soldiers talk after a long day, when tired minds crave something honest and real. They did not pretend that the wound would vanish, or that the doctor's mistake would simply be erased by time. They did not pretend that the hospital's ledger would not reveal a painful truth. They spoke instead of what it might mean to live with the injury's shadow, of the possibility of healing in a life that would never be the same, but could still be lived slowly, with care and with mercy. The next morning brought a morning that looked less like a battlefield's glare and more like a room's careful truth. The world's noise, the year's rain, the clang of a distant gate, mellowed into the background as Calix began a slow, deliberate effort to speak aloud, the confession that his body's story could now carry into the light. "I'm not sure what a future looks like," he told Mara, "but I know I cannot let this era, define the rest of my days." "Not entirely." Mara's hands folded in her lap, the way a schoolmaster's might when listening to a confessed fear from a student. "Then we'll find a way to define it," she said, and the simple certainty in her voice felt to Calix like a small beacon shining in a deep, cold sea. And in the following hours, the hospital began to print a rumor that felt almost like a relief. The idea that the truth would not be shy about its own consequences, that the investigation's results would inevitably come to light and perhaps bring some measure of accountability for the mistakes that ruined more than a life's future. Calix did not want vengeance. He wanted accountability, a way for the living to reconcile the broken ledger with what remained of their humanity. Yet the investigation's progress ran parallel to a deeper, private reckoning within Calix, a slow, stubborn process of learning to live with a reality in which his body did not match the world's expectations, or even his own mind's image of a future. He was compelled to speak more, to own the truth of what had happened, and to demand his own right to hope and to a life that did not faint away under the weight of a single catastrophic error. Days turned into more days, and the war outside the tent's thin walls never stopped reminding him of casualties beyond the gauze and wounds, his own body's language already described. The doctor's sobriety, the surgeon's responsibility, the hospital's record-keeping, all of these mattered. But what mattered more to Calix was his own capacity to survive the truth's long, heavy journey, and to live with it in a way that would prove something to the world and to himself. As the week wore on, Calix's body began to respond in small, stubborn ways, an appetite that returned, a warmth that spread through his chest when Mara sat at the bed's edge and spoke to him of ordinary things like the weather or a newly discovered song among the camp's musicians. or a mother's letter from home that had finally found a way to make its way to him through the war's fever. The world's ordinary textures, taste, touch, scent, sound, began to re-enter his life in minute, almost unnoticeable ways. The memory of the operation, however, did not vanish. It settled inside him like a map with a few lines drawn in the wrong place. A map that would take time to redraw, and yet the core concept that a soldier had his penis amputated by an inebriated surgeon's misstep, and that the patient, 3 days later, chose to end his life, pressed upon every conversation, every whispered rumor, every quiet moment the hospital shared with one another. The past could not be undone, and the present could not pretend that the mistake did not change the future's shape. The world would never erase what had happened. What the world could do was learn, and to show mercy where no mercy had been given before. One afternoon, the news arrived in a tone of formal restraint, but the words carried a force that felt like a storm, breaking in slow motion. An official letter, with a seal that had traveled from the city's center to the camp's edge, announced that the investigation into the operation's outcome had concluded, that Harrow's conduct would be reviewed, that the hospital would publish its findings for the families and the soldiers who would one day read the archives. The letter offered a careful language of accountability, a language that was both bureaucratic and moral, fair sign that the truth might be allowed to stand on its own 2 feet. Calix felt a strange relief in that moment, a sense that a line might finally be drawn in the sand, that the world would know what had happened, that not all wounds could be treated with silence. He did not know whether the truth would repair him or the world's memory of the event. He only knew that the day's news would be a turning point, a moment when the room's quiet could become a louder, more open room in which people spoke plainly about guilt and responsibility. On the 3rd day of the letter's arrival, a quiet, devastating thing happened. Calix awoke in the morning with a sense that something was not right in the air, an extra weight to the room's temperature, a heaviness that clung to the lungs no matter how deeply one breathed. It was a morning when Mara came to his bed with a solemn look he had never seen on her before, the look of someone who has walked through the war's worst hours and found a new cold map waiting beyond the tents. "Doors, Calix," she whispered, her voice not quite a whisper but not quite loud. It was the tone of a person who is about to tell you something you cannot bear to hear, and yet you needed to hear it anyway. There is news that will be hard for you to hear. It concerns what happened to you, and also what you have chosen to endure. Her words were not a sentence of condemnation. They carried the raw weight of truth, of consequences. The doctor's report, the letter's findings, and the truth of what had happened to Calix had been laid bare for those who would read them. The room's air thickened, and Calix's breath slowed, as if his body was trying to tune itself to a new frequency, one that would make the old song disappear and leave him singing a different kind of memory. "What is it?" he managed, though his throat felt like it had learned a new form of pain. Mara's gaze sought his, and when she found it, she did not soften her expression. She spoke with a careful directness that was the hospital's own language for the moment of truth. 3 days after the amputation, 3 days, Calix, the soldiers who kept your papers found the rod map you carry with you in your body. It's clear now that the organ removed was not your own. It was the wrong part. The surgical records show a misidentification, a failing in the line between the wound and the operation. There will be consequences. Calix heard the words, but did not understand their immediate significance. He needed a moment to realize that this revelation did not bring him relief. It did not erase what had happened to him, or the life he would live after. It did not bring back the body he had not known how to love, or the future that would now be shaped by the truth's weight rather than by the soldier's own strength. And then, with the memory of a lifetime's pain surfacing within him, he understood something else. The patient who had died or who had chosen to live within this new truth would not be the same man in the world outside this tent. Neither would he be the same man in the mirror. The world beyond the tent would judge, and will continue to judge, the one who had lived through this tragedy, and the one who had caused it or allowed it to happen by his own acts, even if no one would ever hold him responsible in a court of law in this war's world. Calix opened his mouth, as if to plead for something, some mercy, some memory, some way to go back to a time before this news had invaded his life. But no words came out that could heal the moment. Instead, he gazed at Mara's steady face, at the nurse's careful hands and at the room's quiet, then spoke the first words that would set into motion a final choice no one wanted to hear. "If the records prove what you say," he began, his voice a rough thread, "and if I am to live with this truth, I need a final question answered. Not for you, not for Harrow, not for the hospital, but for me. If I am living with a wrong wound, does that make me less of a man? Do I still have a life that is mine to own?" Mara's eyes softened, the hard edge of her resolve giving way to a tenderness she did not often display in front of the men's eyes. "You're a man who has survived more than most," she replied gently. "A man who bears a brutal truth and still asks to keep living with it. That is the measure of your courage, Calix. Not the absence of pain, but the willingness to endure it with a name you still choose to carry." Her words did not erase the pain, but they gave him a reason to listen to the world and to his own heart. He realized that the path forward would not be easy. It would be a long, complicated road of accountability, healing, and perhaps forgiveness, from others and from himself. Yet the memory of what had happened, the surgeon's intoxicated misstep, the wrong organ removed, the 3 days that stretched into a life's worth of despair, remained the story's core. And with Mara's quiet, unwavering presence, Calix found a fragile sense that life could still be lived, even when the body's truth could not be hidden, even when the world's judgment would still come. That night, Calix lay in his bed, the sheet crisp against the skin that would always carry the scar, the world outside the tense skin of leather and canvas breathing, with a rhythm that did not stop. The night's quiet smelled of damp wool and oil, of rain on the river and the smoke of distant fires. He thought of the letter's truth, and the idea that someone might finally tell him what the world would call right or wrong, and he pressed his hands together, fingers interlaced, as if that simple gesture could bind him to something larger than himself, something more permanent than a single choice. 3 days after the operation, with the hospital's inquiries continuing and the camp's talk growing denser, Calix's life reached its darkest moment, a moment the mind could not outpace or outrun, the moment he decided that the body that remained did not deserve to bear the burden of a life that would be judged not for the courage that had kept him alive, but for an error that ruined more than his future. He did not seek to end his life for revenge or as a statement against the surgeon. He sought relief from the pain that would not let him live with the truth he now carried. The decision came with a sort of surgical clarity, the mind's quiet, rational voice that emerges only when the heart cannot bear the noise of the world any longer. He believed that if he could end the pain, if he could escape the memory of the wrong organ and the world's reaction to it, he might find something like peace in the shadow of the war's ruin. He did not seek to punish anyone. He sought to end the unending ache. And so, in a quiet moment of pre-dawn violence, with the hospital's breath slow and waiting, Calix took the offered path, the one that would allow him to escape a future shaped by a brutal misstep and the world's judgment of it. He did not announce it. He did not speak of it. He did not leave a note that would tell 100 future readers how to interpret his end. He simply chose to end his life, 3 days after the amputation that had not been his fault, and 3 days after the truth he could not bear to hear became public. When the nurse found him, the room carried a sigh of stillness that felt almost holy, a moment in which every heartbeat belonged to a different measure. The lamp cast a pale glow over his body, the sheet drawn tight to his chest, the breath moving in little measured waves as if the life within him sought a gentler exit. The smell of antiseptic and old linen hung in the air, and the world outside, with its war's drumbeat and its soldiers' footsteps, pressed against the tense fabric, listening in silence for a confession that would never come. The hospital's quiet grew loud then, the kind of hush in which voices become distant, and the truth feels like a book that must be closed and not read aloud. The nurses hovered with a practiced restraint, their gloved hands hovering above the scene, as if they could hold back the tide of loss. Calix's eyes remained open, though the room swam with the heavy gravity of the final moment, and his breath grew shallow, a series of shallow puffs that spoke of a body surrendering to its fate. In the morning, the camp woke to a different day, one where the air bore the soft, sour scent of coming rain and the memory of a man who had survived, yet could not bear to live with his survival's cost. The soldiers around him spoke in hushed tones about the day's work, the investigation's progress, the hospital's ledger, and the rumor of truth's arrival in some form that could answer the questions that had haunted them all. Calix Morven's name itself drifted through the camp and the hospital's halls, a memory at once too heavy and too ordinary to vanish. He had been a soldier in a war that did not end with victory, but only with a new kind of sorrow, one that came not from the enemy's blade, but from the failure of a single man's judgment, a failure worn by the man who wore the uniform and the man who wore the coat of the healer, and by the body that bore the scar of what was done in the name of saving a life with her. Truth of what happened to Calix, what the world would eventually know through the records and the whispers of the hospital's corridors, would be weighed against the many wars that would come after him. The hospital's report would attempt to lay out the chain of cause and consequence, to assign responsibility, to give voice to the patient who couldn't demand it for himself, to the man who drank when he should have kept still, to the world that would always ask what happened, and why and who is to be held accountable. But for Calix Morven, the story ended where the world's questions could not reach him, at least not now. He left behind a life of soldierly duty, and the brutal truth that even the best intentions, coupled with human error, could tear a person's future away, leaving nothing but the memory of what might have been and the quiet, stubborn longing to believe that some future could still be worthy of being lived. The final result of the investigation would be a ledger's whisper in the archives, a note that acknowledged the wrong organ's removal and the doctor's misjudgment, a quiet confession that would outlive Calix by years, years during which men would still tell the war's stories in voices both gentle and sharp, years in which another generation might read the documents and decide whether mercy or justice should take the stage in the aftermath of such a tragedy. And in the living world, the hospital would endure with its own quiet wounds and its own stubborn hopes, hoping that the record would serve as a warning and a reminder. Never forget that a life, however brave, can be changed forever by the care and the fallibility of the people sworn to protect it. Calix Morven's memory lingered in the hospital's hallways, a name spoken in whispers and at times with a reverent hush, as if the room itself knew that the man who had lived through the war and the operation had left behind more than a body's scar. He left a legacy that would haunt the living and the dead, a stark, undeniable truth about a single misstep that had cost a life, not simply a body, but a future's light. And so, the story closes where it began, with Calix Morven's name spoken into the dawn's first light, a final breath exhaled into memory, and a silence that follows a life taken not by the enemy's hand, but by the consequences of a mistake made under the feverish, whiskey-stoked improvisation of a battlefield hospital. The record